moon, sun, day, night, earth and heavens, dark and light. I'm Neila, and in this video I'll be diving into my inversion theory. By the end of it, you'll no doubt see why others on the Lorelines crew sometimes call me the color inversion guy. Buckle up and grab your tinfoil hats, because this one might just turn your world upside down. The idea of light and darkness existing both in opposition to and in harmony with one another long predates Final Fantasy XIV. Perhaps the best, and most well-known example of it would be the philosophy of yin-yang, or inyo as it is better known in Japan. Originating in China, it is an ancient system of belief and approach to life, and I do mean ancient. The characters and basic concepts date as far back as 3,500 years ago. The basic idea is that yin and yang, symbolizing dark and light, together embodied the universe in a dynamic harmony that gives rise to life and change. Of course, it's a lot more involved than simply dark and light. What started as a way to describe how the sunny and shaded faces of a mountain would swap positions from morning to evening has grown to become a philosophy describing unity in what seem to be opposed forces. Yin, the negative or perceptive principle, is depicted by the broken line and is associated with shadow, night, femininity, passivity or rest, water, and at its extreme, freezing. Yang, the positive or active principle, is depicted by the solid line, and is associated with light, day, masculinity, activity or movement, fire, and at its extreme, boiling. Neither, however, is representative of evil or good. Rather, evil might be seen when the harmony that should exist between these principles is out of balance. When in harmony, they exist in an ever-changing equilibrium as one transforms to the other and vice versa. Though they appear as opposites, they are in truth different polarities of the same unified concept. Much like breaking a magnet in half simply gives two smaller magnets instead of a positive and negative magnet, they cannot be separated from one another. They are one another, in a sense. But what does this mean in the context of Final Fantasy XIV? Well, some of those associations and concepts no doubt sounded quite familiar. For one, the elemental wheel behaves in a similar way, with each element giving rise to the next all the way around. The conquests and submissions also evoke it, the conquests being active processes, and the submissions passive ones. Even more than this, though, the concepts of astral and umbral seem to align pretty closely with yin and yang. And, of course, we can hardly talk about astral and umbral without bringing up Hydaelyn and Zodiark. Right off the bat, passive and active give us a link to astral and umbral. As Rianger informs us on the first, the source has been looking at it wrong this whole time, or at least differently. To be clear, ice is and always has been umbral, that has not changed. It's only the connection of light and dark with astral and umbral that is reversed. When looking, for example, at yin, a lot of things there bring Hydaelyn to mind, not least of which is the broken line, which is reminiscent of her sundering power. Only one thing stands out: dark. Similarly, yang fits the associations with Zodiark, aside from the link to light. The explanation of the ethereal wheel alludes to this as well, the astral heavens above being an oblique reference to Zodiark, imprisoned in the moon, and the umbral depths below a reference to Hydaelyn, whom we travel deep into the planet to speak with, is in direct contrast to the principles of yin and yang, where the heavens, being freezing, are yin or umbral, and the planet's molten heart is yang or astral. So right off the bat, this gives us a strong argument for Eorzea's associations being an inversion of the classical ones. In fact, the source, and most probably the initial lore planning and development of the game, uses the traditional associations of dark with the passive principle and light with the active. As I'll discuss later, there's also a scientific basis for the source's view. This setup will feel instinctive and natural to anyone who grew up in a culture steeped in this worldview, making the reveal on the first even more of a surprise. And that is what we find. All you have to do is switch light for dark, and the associations line up perfectly. These clear yin and yang themes are likely why Hydaelyn's summoners sought to shackle Zodiark rather than destroy him. Not only does yin and yang emphasize the importance of harmony, but Final Fantasy XIV does as well. Elidibus took on himself the duty of maintaining the balance between light and dark. And of course, we have seen the consequences of that balance being shattered. The void was entirely consumed by darkness, and the first nearly consumed by light. In a sense, the Ascians are playing a dangerous game by skewing the etheric balances to perform rejoinings. In fact, I wonder if this is why, after the failure of the void, they changed to using singular elements instead of astral and umbral polarities. Whatever the case, these eldest and most powerful of primals are clearly patterned after the philosophy and observations of yin and yang. To be entirely accurate, neither yin nor yang is destructive or creative in the sense that Zodiark and Hydaelyn are. Instead, both aspects are needed for creation and change to occur. Much as life as we know it can neither exist in the molten core of our planet, nor in the frozen emptiness of space. It is where these two areas meet and find balance that life can exist and flourish. Since these fundamental principles are, in yin-yang philosophy, indivisible, it's likely that the creation of Zodiark, a creation intended to rewrite the warped and fading laws of reality, made this division of light and dark possible. Alternatively, it could have been the fading of the laws of nature during the final days that allowed or even caused this division between light and dark, when it would not ordinarily have been possible. Whatever the case, while Zodiark and Hydaelyn are pretty clearly patterned after yin-yang, there are a few key differences. Most notable is that yin-yang is represented by black and white, but neither Zodiark nor Hydaelyn is. Instead, they are blue and purple, colors that are not even opposite on the spectrum. While it is likely these colors were chosen to specifically avoid the light equals good, dark equals bad pitfall, there could well be more to it. Something that has always fascinated me about myths and ancient beliefs is that they are, in a way, the earliest forms of science. When all you know about your world is what you can directly observe, we still find ways to try and explain what we see, what's happening around us. While it hardly resembles the careful process of theory and experimentation we now recognize as modern science, myths are, at their root, just as much an attempt to make sense of a confusing and often dangerous world as science is now. Activity and passivity, or stasis, are interesting from a scientific perspective just as much as from the mythological and philosophical. Scientifically speaking, the universe is composed of objects in varying states of energy, interacting with one another, governed by the laws of thermodynamics, with astral describing a high-energy state, and umbral a low-energy state. It lines up nicely with the physical laws we observe. Of greatest interest here is the electromagnetic, or EM, spectrum. In particular, the section of it that composes the visible light that we can see. As this diagram shows, light is a relatively tiny portion of the full EM spectrum. The longer the wavelength, the lower the energy, meaning that radio waves are the lowest energy, and gamma rays the highest. As for the light portion, red is the low energy side, which would correspond with umbral, and purple the high energy, or astral. Right off, you may notice that this purple looks like Zodiark, which corresponds, as we would expect from the first revelations, with darkness being astral. But Hydaelyn's blue is nowhere near the red side. This is where color inversion comes in. In a way, we've already seen this with the swap of black and white. They do invert to each other after all. However, as you can see, inverting the full spectrum gives a sort of new spectrum, where red and purple are in the middle, with a turquoise blue at the low energy end, and an odd, faintly cyan green at the high energy end. That blue no doubt looks familiar, matching closely with Hydaelyn. So all you have to do is invert the color of the lowest energy, or umbral, color, and it fits. But what even is color inversion? There are many different ways to express color digitally, but for this method the RGB mode is probably easiest. Red, green, and blue values are expressed as a number from 0 to 255, showing how much of each is used to form the final color. If they were all 0, you get black. If they're all 255, you get white. If red and blue are 0, you will get shades of green, and so on. To invert colors in this scale, you simply take each separate value, subtract that value from 255, and make that difference the new value. This process naturally makes dark things light and light things dark, while maintaining saturation values. But why only invert the low energy side and not the high energy side? Well, for starters, this is just a theory. This particular approach fits what we see, both in terms of umbral and astral, as well as matching the data points given by Hydaelyn and Zodiark's colors. But let's take another look at that particular hue of green we get from inverting the astral side. Have you seen this anywhere before? Well, there's the singularity reactor. The portion of Hell's cure when it mentions that the aromatama has begun to disrupt the life stream. The twinning. Specifically, the odd underground portion called the underworld. Speaking of, did you ever notice these cracks in its walls? Thanks, Shadow Meowth. And of course, the sundering itself. Not only in the mural. In Eden's Verse Refulgence, the same effect, and the same color, is used. There are myriad other instances of the color, of course, from the Chrysalis battle to elements of Az's Law and parts of Heaven on High. Without more information, though, it's hard to say if any of these are related. However, there are numerous instances of the Zodiark-esque purple littered throughout the game as well. To me, the most notable of these is the single tree in the Crystarium that does not match the others. Not only are its leaves the more Zodiark purple, but it has an odd greenish glow radiating up from its base. Another big one is Emmett Salk's Constellation Crystal, which is strikingly close in color. Of course, inverting Hydaelyn's color gives us a very particular shade of crimson that may be familiar. This color, and its inverse, make numerous appearances in the game as well. By inverting her color, we find ourselves with the highest and lowest energy colors, each associated with the deiform entity in question. One simple inversion, tied to the one who turned everything on its head with the sundering, Hydaelyn. Donning my tinfoil hat once more, I'll take a moment to point out the way that primals, as well as the synthetic Arasite seen in the Werelit storyline, warp reality around them, changing not only the battlefields where we fight them, but even the weather itself. The warping of etheric and physical laws that Lahabrea mentions in the Praetorium certainly makes a kind of sense when taken with the revelation that Hydaelyn is herself a primal. It sounds much like the same thing, just on a massive scale. If she is somehow warping reality, and I at least see no better way to describe the sundering, it certainly explains why the Ascians speak of her in this way, since the Unsundered would remember how the world was before her creation. This is no small part of why I tie color inversion to her specifically, at any rate. But what gave me the idea to try inverting colors in the first place? Color inversions actually occur in Final Fantasy XIV itself. The first one I noticed was the one that occurs when the Axe of Light strikes Hades after the battle in the Dying Gasp. Easy to dismiss as a neat effect to make the scene a little more badass. But it's not the only occurrence, not by a long shot. While going through the Werelit questline, I could hardly miss the dramatic ones that took place at the end of the Sapphire weapon fight and during the trial of Xenos' data. Now that I was watching for it, I just kept seeing it. How long has this effect been in use, though? The first occurrence I've located is in 2.0 proper, though it's only for legacy characters. The Scions and Heads of State regain their obscured memories of the Warrior of Light, and for a moment the color inverts. This occurrence is a bit of an outlier as it happens, probably because it's so early. However, with memory tied to souls, and both being ether, it's still worth mentioning. It's also not the only occurrence in A Realm Reborn. During the second phase of the Chrysalis battle, not only do the colors swap from dark to light, but the platforms, statues, everything is turned upside down. And of course, the A Realm Reborn art book's cover bears a depiction of Hydaelyn in inverted color. And let's not forget the very end of A Realm Reborn, where Minfilia hears Hydaelyn's voice. We see the same ribbon of light followed by color inversion, as in the Legacy cutscene. In fact, that animation looks just like the ones we see in our first vision of her. Between that and both the Heads of State and Minfilia confirming it to be Hydaelyn's voice speaking to them, there is no question. This inversion is tied to Hydaelyn. The next incident I found was the animation of the Enigma Codex sending Alexander and all aboard back in time, though it's possible this is simply a representation of time turning backwards and unrelated to the other soul-tangential inversions. There's also that slightly concerning patch art from 3.2 where Minfilia is chained by Hydaelyn. If you look down in the corner, you'll see that it's turning a very particular shade of orange. Thanks, Bonnie. Stormblood seems much shorter on occurrences. The next in-game instances I found are in Shadowbringers. It starts right off with an inversion during the Warrior of Light's journey through the Rift. Teslene's transformation also features one, and perhaps you're beginning to see why I associate the event with soul shenanigans. Of course, there's the previously mentioned weapon of light striking Hades, and also the odd, and largely unexplained, double view of Elidibus in Ardbert's body, featuring one on either side of the vision. As an aside, my tinfoil hat theory is that the Warrior of Light was somehow able to use Soulsight there. I've already mentioned the occurrences in the Werelit questline, of course, and then there's the transition of Eden's Promise Eternity Savage, that is E12S, where Gaia recovers her memories and accesses the glyph of Loghrif. Obviously, Shadowbringers is where the phenomenon really kicks off. I suspect this is because the plot is finally closing in on the Hydaelyn and Zodiark story. The game's story, of course, begins with Hydaelyn as a mother goddess, a protective and caring deity. However, the revelation of the Elder Primals' origins may cast some aspersions on this impression. Knowing that she was created specifically to defeat and bind Zodiark sets the stage for a potential reversal of expectations. And how better to visually show this than by inverting dark and light? Those might be the obvious instances of inversion, but there are a number of much more subtle ones scattered throughout the game. Have you looked closely at the murals in the Katana Ravel before? The drawings there are edged in light colors rather than dark, and outlining things in darker colors is very much the norm where outlines are used. So what happens if you invert them? Well, the buildings in the drawing of Amrat turn white with gold highlights and blue windows, just like in Emmett Slug's Recreation. And across the board, the borders become dark, and the blue and orange used invert precisely to one another. But these aren't the only murals we see. There are also a few in the areas of Raktika controlled by the Children of the Everlasting Dark. 2 of these are also lined in light colors rather than dark. The more eye-catching of the 2 shows a representation of Ardbert and his comrades standing before a swirl of darkness. Though we first met them in their guises as the Warriors of Darkness, they've only ever been known on the first as Warriors of Light. As such, their depiction as dark figures is most unusual. Of course, inverting this mural puts that to right, giving us white figures edged in light blue. What's more, it transforms the swirl of darkness, which one might assume to be whatever dark entity they were trying to defeat, into something that looks quite a lot like the flood of light. The second one depicts warriors victorious over some kind of monster. Wait a moment. Let's take a closer look. Well now, when you invert this mural, it looks like a bunch of Hydaelyn-colored heroes defeating a Sin Eater. That doesn't seem like a coincidental color palette. This is a direct inversion of the art book's reproduction of the mural, and it's not the only sneaky inversion placed in the game without comment. Have you ever noticed how the shades in Amrat have this odd glow beneath their hoods and robes? Funny enough, if you invert their color, that turns to perfectly normal-looking shadow down to the seams and folds of their robes. Also of note, the aetherometer settings in G-Pose reduces all color to a flat blue and inverts it, making dark things light and vice versa. I have a strong suspicion that Charlian aetherometers show what typical ethersight looks like, and Hades and Hythlodaeus just get the color version of that. There's another extremely sneaky inversion early in the game. When the Warrior of Light gets their first crystal of light, we get a vision of a strange, perhaps ethereal place. As we get crystals one by one, they are added to this diagram in what might be a familiar pattern. It is the same shape and order as the elemental diagram Urianger shows us on the first, the one from the lore book. However, the triangle denoting the conquests, which connects lightning, earth, and water, is lit up in the diagram, but shown as dark on the poster. In the same way, the submissions, the triangle on top connecting wind, fire, and ice, is dark in the lit up diagram, but white on the poster. The wheel our crystals of light stand on is the inverse of the lore books. By now, it won't come as any surprise that inverting the color makes it match up once more, as well as giving us that deep red. However, it's also worth noting that inverting the crystals of light actually gives us more or less the same set of colors, though much higher in saturation, which would make sense given that the dark, or astral pole, is aligned with activity. It gives me some hope that we might get crystals of darkness to help us truly uphold balance. It should also be mentioned that the Warrior of Light stands in the portion of the diagram that seems to represent the World Tree, reputed to be the source of all life, which can be no coincidence. There's one more I want to highlight, Fandaniel's glyph. I believe that, rather than simply using the light portions, they inverted the glyph and then used the new black portions, much like all the other glyphs use the black portions. What's more, It's certainly no coincidence that he chooses to wear a white robe when we first see him, in stark contrast to the typical Ascian black. There are a number of external references that are worth bringing up as well. While they're not strictly part of Final Fantasy XIV, so many themes and characters are drawn from other games, I think they're worth a glance. Final Fantasy XII is especially noteworthy, since the Ascian titles, epithets or Sign of Light titles, and glyphs themselves are all drawn directly from it. So Zalera, the Scion of Darkness, created in opposition to Emet-Selch, having a color inversion in his final attack, and of course, that shade of green, is quite noteworthy. There's also the Shadowbringer's short stories. The fourth tale from the shadows, Through His Eyes, is told from Emet-Selch's point of view. When he looks on the livestream after the Sundering, what he sees is a wan, sickly glow. What that means in terms of visuals is not entirely clear, but color inversion is certainly one thing that would fit the descriptor. Final Fantasy VII is another big one. Its livestream, as well as the Mako that is made from it, is a similar eerie green. In fact, I can't help but wonder if it's the source of that color, given that the livestream is an important aspect of both games, but not so much others in the franchise. It certainly serves as a simple way to visually connect the concepts, at the least. There are plenty of other connections as well, such as the idea of the planet itself being wounded, and Xenos' general similarities to Sephiroth, so I don't think it's too much of a stretch. It should also be mentioned that the structure shown in the dungeon showcase, the purple pillared area that seems to be inside one of the Tilo towers, bears a striking resemblance to the interior of the Ifa tree from Final Fantasy IX, which was key to supplanting that world's native life to replace it with the souls of the invaders. Even more, color inversion ties these two together. Thanks to Alaric for catching this and bringing it to my attention. It's hard to predict exactly what this might mean, but I will certainly be eyeing it with extreme interest as I play Endwalker. If you haven't played Final Fantasy IX before and need something to fill the content lull before Endwalker, it might be worth giving it a playthrough. I have a few other theories based out of themes and events of that game, though that's best left to another video. Speaking of Endwalker, I'm interested to see how the themes of yin and yang will play out as we approach the end of the Hydaelyn and Zodiark story arc. It's plain to me that these themes are intentional. Much like the representation of yin and yang, where each carries a seed of the other within it, ready to begin the transformation to its counterpart, the stage is set for drastic change and upheaval that will, in due time, give rise to balance. Will we return to a state like the one the Word of the Mother describes, when light and dark did once dwell as one? I'm sure I'm not the only one looking forward to the possibility of learning in more detail what happened back in the time of the Ancients' calamity, and the summoning of the Big Two. And if Inversion does indeed turn out to feature in the Endwalker MSQ, well, you'll probably hear my screams all the way up on the moon. Of course, I'm sure I've missed some color inversions somewhere in the game. If you know of another example of it, please leave a comment to let me know. And of course, if you enjoy this kind of content, check out the rest of our videos. Consider subscribing to the channel, and tune in Sunday afternoons to the podcast on YouTube or Twitch. I'm Neila, signing off. Man, this tinfoil hat sure makes your head hot, doesn't it?